very much. Khaled.
There are many events to refer to as very important sort of scenarios. The event on February 15th or 14th of the human rights lawyer Fatih Turbo making an announcement in Benghazi, speaking on behalf of the Abu Slim massacre families, victims' families. Where he was speaking, I think I know where he was in Benghazi, was at one of something called the Social Networks organization. They had gone to Muammar Qaddafi, they had gone to SAFE, they had gone to SAFE's Human Rights, they had gone to the Ministry of Justice, they had gone to several. And the last place they were pushed into was this Qiyadati Shari. I think it was sort of the popular leadership's union. And it's sort of the social services division of that. Basically, these families were suffering. They wanted some, more than anything, I think they wanted acknowledgement, and they wanted the location of the bodies of the dead of that massacre in 1996. And also they wanted some help. And so where Fatih Turbo had given the speech, I think they had approached this organization, and basically they were never going to give it anything in writing. And so he made a speech, it was recorded, it went on the net. He was immediately arrested. Upon his arrest, people came out on the street in Benghazi. Several people were killed, and then Idris al-Masmari was arrested. It continued. But I want to go back to an event a few days before the big culmination of Qaddafi's town hall sort of democratic system are these town hall meetings that usually happen in December, attended by very, very few people, and where people are told to shut down their stores and they must go and attend. And I've seen this cat and mouse game in Benghazi, where in my brother's own store, where the store is halfway shut. If you want to buy a tire, you have to sort of come in, then they open it, and they see the Harris Baladi or the local guards telling people to shut down, and they shut down and they open, and no one goes to these meetings. But Gaddafi likes to attend. One year he attended as part of the audience, and he was, of course, nobody looked at the people at the table, everybody, the whole camera went to the audience, one member of the audience. But this year he went to Sabha. Of course, this was during, I think the Tunisian, I looked for it for the actual video to get the exact date. During the Tunisian crisis, maybe before his I'm sad that Ben Ali is gone speech, you shouldn't have revolted against him. But what had happened was that he had come to preside over this town hall meeting. And to me, that event has a lot to say. What the video recorded was a young man speaking, saying, great leader, there are apartments, there's housing needed in Sabha, we need them, we have signed for these apartments to be given to us, and we have not received them. And Qaddafi asked this young man, said, who are you, where are you from, what tribe? Oh, this tribe, are you affiliated to this other tribe? When did you, are you Libyan, are you not Libyan? And he said, we're Libyan, we came from Chad in 1981 or early 80s and so on. And so, okay, you're Libyan, fine. So in a sense, it was like, okay, you are Libyan. So this whole idea of how Qaddafi treated Libyan citizenship, Libya as well, this sort of impromptu treatment of it. And he was looking into whether they have papers or do not have papers and so on. And then there was someone from the Sabha sort of bureaucratic group or the popular committee. And Gaddafi asked him, so why don't you give them the apartment? And he said, well, the apartments, they are not completed, the list is long, blah, blah. And there are two things to be aware of here. The bureaucrat could be either two things and maybe another one. One is that it's true. The apartments could not have been ready. Maybe they're never going to be completed. There are so many projects that had been built in Libya that never got completed. In the city of Sabha, there were schools that had gotten second contracts to be refurbished after 20 years or so. But then they discovered that the school never existed to begin with. And so that's, and then some cities were even more cunning. And so what this gentleman who was wearing a headpiece looked like a sort of an earlier Qaddafi fashion, was saying, no, it is complicated. The truth is that the apartments could not have been ready, or that the government had ceased to give them. I was in Tripoli 2 months ago, and somebody said, oh, Armstrong Consultation Group, poor guys, Qaddafi hasn't paid them. It's like a huge American consultative group that gets a lot of money. And even they are complaining that Qaddafi is not paying them. So Qaddafi doesn't pay, they never finish projects on. The other thing that could be possible is that this bureaucrat is, that's his time to make a cut. That's how you make a living as a bureaucrat. If you're a head of a health unit or a school unit or a hospital, this division level, when do you get to sell purchase goods from Germany or Italy or whatever? And when you get to do that, that's when you get to make your big cut. And so you live on a salary of $200 for all of your bureaucratic career, but every now and then you go and they send you to Italy or to some place where you negotiate with a Turkish or German or whatever company, and you make a few $1 million. And that's why you never want to leave that job, because you want to hold that position. So, I don't know the details of what happened in Sabha. Did the bureaucrat, was he not able to actually finish this project because the Libyan treasury never paid? Or is the project not finished because the bureaucrats were waiting for the contractor to pay them? And it could be either one. But that's the system that had happened. Now, what Gaddafi did was said, okay, so what happened to these people? Why don't I get their apartments? Why don't they get them? And there was some expectations. Well, why not? Why don't the people who have the apartments get them? Why don't you go get the apartments? And the hall erupted. It was like Oprah. Everybody was going to get an apartment. And the meeting, they began to chant for him. He began pumping his fists, and he just kind of walked out of the meeting. And then the other people saying, "Meeting in order, come back, let's bring the meeting." And of course it was a circus. Gaddafi solved the problem. He was going to divide the apartments and so on. Well, the thing that was going to happen was that these people that were promised apartments are not likely to get them. They will have to call on Gaddafi again and again to remind him that he had promised them the apartments. But these bureaucrats have some pressure on them for a few weeks to deliver. This ongoing sort of process where there is a cat and mouse game between people, between them and the resources of their government, continuously struggling to get them, is an everyday occurrence. The fact that there are people who are given a certain amount of power that is totally aligned with Gaddafi, and the fact that Gaddafi can get involved in the smallest details. I mean, people who had needed cars were trying to call Gaddafi to get them. You just didn't go to your fellow citizen who's in the booth. You went to as high as you could. When I was in Benghazi a few years ago trying to get my driver's license, which was a whole episode, 3 times episode, there were people who were trying to get permission to wear sandals while driving, because it was against the law to drive having sandals on in Libya. And they didn't go to somebody, they went to the head of the municipality of Benghazi's traffic unit. This is somebody who covers an area of maybe 200 square miles. And they were all, sort of on him to try to get this permit. Because yes, it is absurd, but if you got a ticket for something like this, it can be very expensive. You could never, you'd have to pay for it. And so basically, people were sort of, I'm sorry?
How much of the ticket, curiosity?
I didn't, I paid a different ticket. I never wore sandals in Libya while driving. But a good amount for people. And so the idea of nothing happening without somebody in power that's at a high level solving the problem is part of the chaos. Now, of course, the other thing I mentioned was this Libyan, whether who's Libyan and not Libyan. It's something that it can be played with. We saw that some of these perhaps mercenaries, some of them had been granted citizenship right on the spot. And so this had become fluid, and it had become something very open for negotiation. As far as the government delivering, that's something that people had suffered from. Now, what happened the day after this capricious decision, this moment of everyone getting to have an apartment, it reminded people of something that had happened 30 years ago, when in Gaddafi's Green Book, the statement was the house to whoever resides in it, which is a declaration. It meant that there are no more rental properties. Basically, if you are renting from someone, basically you just stay and you keep the house. I'm sure that's something we'd all love to do. But it did create a lot of chaos in Libya at the time, because it meant that actually people were taking over other people's property when they were gone, and it created lots of difficulties among people. It also allowed the revolutionary committees and people who are highly connected to actually possess property in the name of the revolution and so on. That if you become an enemy of the state, immediately for a reason or another, your property was given. But what happened was, in Benghazi and in Derna and other places, people did go to these apartments to take over. Some of them were not finished. Then the people who had actually been given certificates to and have been waiting for years to receive government apartments were saying, well, we have them. Why do you get them? And so this time around, it seemed very clear that this was a ploy. And it didn't work, because I think that may have been one of the first moments of actual popular resistance, because these people stayed in the apartments. Then the people who were rightful, at least grantees of these apartments, there was a negotiation between them. Some of them pulled out, some of them didn't, but there were people who stayed in. So there was a sort of a sit-in for these apartments. The problem, of course, also is that the demand now for housing in Libya for young people is much higher. The income, when you were a government employee without housing in 1979, your salary would have been about $650 at the time. If you were living on a salary, if you had a job, and you were living on a government salary, your income now would be about 160 current dollars. So if you can imagine, $650 1979, $140 or $150 now. And so things are much worse. The salaries have been frozen for all of these 30 years. So the spark was what I would say in Arabic is a moment, قلب السحر على الساحر, which is where the magic or the magical powers have turned against the magician. And people felt like now they could resist. This was a moment when they can stand their ground. And it was the people negotiating between them what is rightful. Qaddafi had tried to start a ploy to divide people, and somehow the local people in Benghazi and others decided, well, no, this is not a correct thing to do. And so by not having the magician solve the problem was a source of confidence. Now, to go back a little bit as to some of the other sort of tensions, if I were to, or the sort of the historical moments in the history of Libya, if I were to go back to another magical moment perhaps in Libya's history, I would go back to 1988, which would have been maybe April 1988, something called Asbah Subh, morning has broken, I guess how we would call it. When Qaddafi had brought down a prison, he rode a caterpillar, and in another sort of parade, came down with a caterpillar and took down a prison which is called, its popular name is Al-Hisan Al-Aswad, sort of the Black Horse prison. I don't know its official name. And he said no more prisoners, and the name of the Asbah Subh, or the morning has come, or morning has born, if you will, comes from a song by a Sudanese singer that he loved a great deal. And he took down that prison and released the political prisoners who had been held from, well, maybe some of them from 1980. One of the people who was released was Musa Ahmed, who had attempted a coup on him in 1970. So the leftists and Ba'athists were released, some Ikhwan were released. By then you hadn't had the militant Islamists that were held in the 1990s, and maybe some Hizb al-Tahrir members were released, but like a whole generation of perhaps discredited ideologies were released. But what 1980 marked was, from then on, the violence committed against the population was no longer made public. You had more than sort of decades of denial. In 1979, there were public hangings in Benghazi. Those were things that the regime was very proud of. They were shown on television repeatedly to scare the population. The disappearance of Mansour al-Kikhiya in 1991 was never recognized. I mean, this is just to sort of what 1988 may have meant for the regime. Again, there were assassination attempts on Qaddafi in 1984. Those people were hung publicly with clothesline, really. There was just a very thin thread, and when the hangings didn't work, there were members of the revolutionary committees pulling these people from the legs to make sure that they suffocate to death. Well, Abu Salim was never recognized, never acknowledged by the regime until years later, and the bodies were never met. In fact, people who were considered the opposition were not granted the right to be buried in Libya, and there were instances of opposition people who were brought to be buried in Libya, and their corpses were taken to be thrown back into the sea. Well, this was not began to happen. The regime's violence did not end then, but 1988 marked a change. Now, by then, of course, all of the Gaddafi's Arabist street credit is gone. His support of the Palestinians had by then proved to amount to nothing. And the other initiatives that were forthcoming were also proven to be bankrupt. Now, what we've come to now, I guess at this moment, is really Qaddafi's threats and those of his sons. One is that Qaddafi has had a whole, he's coming back to those moments in the late 70s and early 80s when he basically hit people with iron and fire. What also happened is that his son, who was Saif, has joined him. I think Saif's notion would have been that he could perhaps rule over a kind of right-wing Chile or El Salvador, where you could grant people some modicum of high income, if you will, but then you couldn't, they wouldn't be granted free press and so on. The exposure that Libyans had received since the 1990s, they had really lived in a North Korea-style government from the 80s and most of the 90s. What made that impossible? Communications, they tried not to have cell phones in Libya for the longest time, but it didn't work.
I think we should just stop for a moment so we can really get some serious questions in, because we've only got about a half hour left. There's a microphone here which would help if you can get to the microphone, unless you've got a very loud voice. So why don't we start over there and then over here.
Hi, thank you all very much. So a couple of you mentioned this sort of idea that tribalism is not a very revealing way to understand the various fractures in Libyan society, especially in the contemporary political moment. It also strikes me that sort of a simple mass populism of the people versus the regime isn't necessarily so revealing. So I was just wondering if any of you could sort of comment on what you see as the sort of fractures right now politically, given the current situation.
Great. You want to take that, Professor Ahmida?
Okay. The trouble with when you say, oh, Libya has tribes, I ask myself, what does it mean? How is it being defined? Is it really a tribal organization that existed in 1950? Is it means that people are autonomous from the state? Does it mean that the tribe is really not integrated in the modern economy? What does it mean? It's very confusing. Reduction is simple, but very, very much confusing term. Now, tribes and clans do exist in Libyan society, but also their role today is different from what used to be 50 or 40 years ago or 70 years ago. What we have to understand is when the regime has made, since the 1970s, political parties, unfortunately also the monarchy, banned political parties. And when the regime began to really weaken and then destroy all independent trade unions and professional organizations. For example, just to give you a case in point, Libya, and I was part of that movement in the late 70s, had one of the best student independent organization in the whole region. It was taken, by demonstration and also by blood by many students who demonstrated in 1964. And the monarchy granted the students an independent trade union. That very militant, very well organized, very democratic trade union was destroyed physically in 1976 in the so-called the Students' Revolution, or Februari, or the April 7th. The army and the thugs of the regime attacked Libyan universities, killed some of the student leaders, arrested others, and banned all kind of organizations. And some, they had to stay in exile since that time. Now, the fact that the state did not tolerate any of these organizations that existed, either lawyers' guilds, labor union, student unions, other associations. Most Libyans were left with Gaddafi's, formal institutions, the mosque, and your own extended family or your tribe or clan, and it's natural that you lean on them. Now, when you define it in that sense, they do exist in Libya today. But when you reduce Libyan society, tribes, tell us. They call me sometimes, Ali, Professor Ahmida, what kind of tribes exist there? Is this really in Magarha, or this is the so and so and so and so? And I go crazy. I say, no, I'm not going to talk about this. Go do your homework. So this is the trouble with it, and unfortunately, it's so pervasive that people now accept it as a fact. And only by critically thinking about these assumptions and locate these kinship organization in the larger context of urban and other organizations, and with their own meaning, we could understand that Libya, yes, it's a huge country. It's the fourth largest country, and that's after the independence of Southern Sudan, it will be the third largest country in Libya. And as in any other country, it has regional diversity in terms of accent, in terms of a little bit. But also Libya is very integrated since the last since independence in '51, and only by locating the diversity of Libya, modern association, traditional associations, all these groupings, then we can make sense of them. But to say, oh, tribal divisions, it gives you a clear answer, but it doesn't explain nothing. In the contrary, it's really a hindrance and a confusing term.
Thank you very much. Question here.
I think one of the major problems now is that Qaddafi has no safe exit. Even if he leaves for exile, he knows now that he will be prosecuted by the ICC and Ocampo for crimes against humanity. So the most dangerous thing now is that he's in a kill or die situation. So how do you see it evolving, especially that he himself warned about a civil war, and then Hillary Clinton warned about a bigger Somalia. So do you see this happening as a possibility?
Well, there are maybe Qaddafi's is much more of a unifying figure than we think, because he's so reviled by so many people that that in itself actually can guarantee a modicum of national unity. I think there is a lot to think about in terms of, to continue what Ali was saying and to go is that there is a lot of these 40 years have a great many moments of simultaneity. These moments of watching the hangings as one nation, that's sort of a national trauma, a common sense of theft, of deprived potential. That's one feeling that all people, I think in Libya, a great many people feel. And also I think people in Libya, they, Qaddafi said, Libya, we're not Tunisia and we're not Egypt, and he's right. Exactly, Libyans feel like we're not Tunisia, we're not Egypt, and the tribal affiliation that Ali talked about is not sufficient. The truth is that anybody in your tribe could help you if they were in the revolutionary committee. The sheikh of your tribe could not necessarily believe you, help you, unless he's got somebody in Qaddafi's tribe, and political tribe, if you will. So the oil is perhaps an organizing factor, because that's a centralized a source of income. And so far, that hasn't been divided, and I don't think that that's going to be easily divided yet among the East or the West. So as far as Libya becoming Somalia, I don't think so. I think the Somalis spread into little groups because they had to really fend for themselves perhaps in the most desperate ways. But in Libya, the structure, the structure of the oil system as a centralizing factor, and I think there is a sense of it being. Oil has never been thought of in any tribal terms. It happens to be in lands that don't belong to any particular tribe that I know of. I mean, I don't think I've heard of people of Gaddafi saying that this belongs to us or anything to that. So in a sense, the oil is probably as much of a unifying source as any. What will Qaddafi do? I think the coordination that's going to need to happen between the elements that are independent in the East, and then the coordination that they make with the West, the Western parts, is going to decide all of that. But strangely enough, I feel that Qaddafi's persistence in power may actually sort of unify the country around him rather than divided. I wonder.
Just a quick response to Muhammad's question. I think so. Whether Libya will become another Somalia, that's a possibility. Iraq was unified, urban, secular, and look at what happened in Iraq. Gutted and seen through tribalism, sectarianism, and suddenly things we never thought of. So I think in societies these things are possible. It's not inconceivable. But I think Khaled is right in the sense that the speeches, the discussions, the statement we have been hearing from Eastern Libya, from Misrata, from Zawiya, from other parts of Libya, actually, very much for a unified country, for a different country, for a hopeful country, and awareness even in the East region, which is historically has been marginalized, and historically has its own kind of psyches about the central government, especially after 1969. It has been really emphasizing Tripoli is our capital. We want the Libya of the future. We are capable of doing that, and we want a unified alternative Libya. Now, what worries me is that the discussion so far, which is a human, everybody's talking about getting rid of the dictatorship, which is right. But less has been said about what are the Libyans for? What kind of alternative? I think it's understandable to raise the independence flag, which is, symbolized a lot for Libyans. Good thing, good days. Now, but what kind of 5 or 6 demands are we gonna, what are we gonna do about the constitution? What's gonna happen to Libya after Gaddafi? And these are hard questions. It's not, enough to say that we just want to get rid of the dictatorship and everything's gonna be good. I think that's really a little bit naive, maybe human, but naive, and it would be good to encourage that debate to come out. And one more thing is also important, and I said it in many interviews. I think we should respect the leadership and the youth who are leading the revolt. The exiled community should support that, but should stay out of it.
I may add that I think the solutions that people are looking for are or what people have undergone to create this revolution. There's the internet, there's technology, there's communication. I mean, a lot of the sort of the mindset is an urban mindset, and also the fact that these young people want work. I don't think that the tribal configurations that people may think of are going to be savvy enough to provide jobs or work that demands a kind of stability and contact with technology and contact with and markets and creating of markets. And in a sense that's tribalism would not I think withstand that. The kind of life, the life that the young people are looking for is not, I think, that can be provided by the tribal structures that Libya has or has had.
Which might be a change in Libyan history. Libyan history, very briefly, up to 1931, Libya has been dominated by society over the state. This is different from Egypt. That Professor Gran was talking about. Libya until 1931, until the crushing of the last pocket of resistance, was dominated by the countryside. We could say that the society was stronger than the state. And it's no secret, if you think about it, modern Libya, post-colonial Libya, had 2 leaders. Guess where they come from? From the countryside. King Idris, the grandson of the great, brilliant scholar of 19th century, Muhammad bin Ali Sanusi, who founded a remarkable modern movement based on education and trade. And after that, Gaddafi also came from the countryside. I think Khaled's observation is accurate, because we might see now something coming from the urban, modern sector of the society. And as a matter of fact, I think Libyan tribes are weakened in de facto way.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ahmida, you've mentioned a couple of times now the flag. and I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about that. Why do you think people have latched onto the flag of the Senussi monarch as a symbol of this moment? Is it just because it's the only symbol they had access to of a unified Libya that had nothing to do with Gaddafi, or is this actually speaking to some kind of revitalization of the idea of the Senussi as liberators of Libya? And a related question, which I don't expect anyone can actually answer right now, is where did all of these flags come from? All of the sudden we have all of these flags. Who's producing them? And who decided that this would be the big symbol of the moment?
Well, let's try the second one. I saw a Libyan American colleague with a flag. He could answer it for us because he has a one, I think, there. And apparently some of them are printed here in America. Some are at home. I don't know. This is an empirical question. I cannot really. But the first question, I think, is a very good one. I can make two possible answers for your question. The first one, when you look at how Libya ended ruled by a very, very bankrupt, exhausted, authoritarian state with a very, very limited social base, headed by somebody who's now the king of kings of Africa. He's transformed from third world, liberator or revolutionary to the king of kings. So that gives you an idea about that. Now, most Libyans, humanly, when they think about their fathers, their grandfathers, and their mothers and grandmothers, the monarchy looks really peaceful and looks modernizing with all its mistakes and flaws and contradictions. It was the only 2 decades that Libyan people, who really, we should pity them, they had a horrible 20th century. A horrible 20th century. And I spent my whole life trying to write about how brutal and how devastating the colonization in Libya was. You're talking about almost half of the population, 500,000 people perished during the 40 years of colonization. And 60,000 of them, and I'm writing a book about that, perished in concentration camps before even the Holocaust, under Italian fascist regime. The flag symbolically was made because, yes, elitist group of people, notable tribal chiefs and urban folks and so, but it was, selected and chosen by an assembly, a general assembly of Libyan elite that time. And it was, people liked it because many Libyans, including my generations and the one before me and after me, it was the flag that symbolized Libyan independence, which was, with all its limitation, was a major achievement. I think symbolically, Libyans see this as a source of defiance against how things are today. Also, they see that as a way of nostalgia for good times. And as the Iranian people, I mean, you have to know that in the Iranian struggle against the Shah's dictatorship, what was the major first demand for them? The constitutional of 1905 revolution. So Libyans, symbolically, I think they are nostalgic for it. Now, I do have a caution and worry. We do have a royalist opposition too. Now, no matter how good, and there is a point for that, the monarchy years were, going back would be a huge mistake. Because the challenge for the Libyan people to overcome the monarchy and the King of Kings, Jamahiriya as well, to look for the future. And that's going to take a lot of hard work beyond just them protesting and trying to topple a regime that's really now against the wills of the majority of the Libyans.
Just to add, our mutual friend, Dr. Mohammed Mufti, who's a medical doctor and historian, in early 2000 published an article about Libya in the 1930s. And he was immediately interrogated. You were not allowed as a Libyan to write anything about the period of colonization that was somewhat positive. Nothing, Idris al-Sanusi's name could not be mentioned in Libya in any sort of text. So in a sense, you had a total suppression of that era. The other thing is, before this ugly green flag that Qaddafi put on the country in '78, you had Libya, he adopted a flag that was red, white, and black, which was very much like the Egyptian flag. And I think in not going to a flag that he'd chosen, whether it was the green or the earlier one, not only is a rejection of anything he had brought to the country, I think it must have been a huge disappointment for Gaddafi to be spited so with this flag that he thought he did. But also, I think the idea of that we're not Egypt is also kind of important, that we have a history that's different, the idea of not Egypt, not Tunisia, and to bring this flag that would infuriate Gaddafi and speak of a time when he did not exist, that we have a history separate from yours, which you had suppressed, I think is significant. I think the monarchy has no history in Libya, personally. I think there's a lot of nostalgia, perhaps among very old people, but I don't think it has any history at all. Certainly not in the western side of Libya, but in the east, I think it has very little stock.
Hi, if I may make a comment. First, as an Iranian specialist, the demand of the revolutionaries in 1979 was to bring back constitutional monarchy, but the original demands were to get rid of US imperialism and then get rid of the Shah. So I couldn't avoid stating this. But the events of the past 4 or 5 weeks have been tremendously important in the Middle East and in the Arab world, with implications for the rest of the world, actually, because we're hearing of uprisings here and there occurring, even as far as Hong Kong, for example. And it's really much too early to make a sense as to what is going to happen, what is going to be the new power structure, and so on. What's so interesting to me is that Cairo, with all its power, can fall within 18 days, whereas the struggle in Libya is going to continue, and certainly it has been continuing in such places as Iran. So I wonder what kind of scenarios you can describe in terms of where the struggles may be going. That is one question, and if I may pose another question, and that is, a number of colleagues make references to class and gender composition, as well as women's organization within the context of the current struggle. I wonder whether you can address this gender question a little bit more, because there's really a lack of information on this question, and we're not hearing anything about what is happening to gender question, and if you would provide any sources for us to look at.
Great.
Thank you.
Professor Gran?
Well, I have some impressions on some of these subjects, I mean, not more than that. If you want to say, why did the Arab world seem to lead the way in terms of sort of a current kind of internationally relevant movement, I think you have to sort of ask, what are the common bases that we suddenly share with the Middle East that cut across a long period of time in this country's history, let's say, or that of Europe, in which we look at ourselves as polar opposites. And to my way of thinking, the answer to that would start out with neoliberalism. It would be Madison, Wisconsin. It would be the destruction of the middle class. And so now, sort of looking at this as a kind of global phenomenon that the middle class all over the world is threatened, and then why is it that the Tunisians and the Egyptians and the Libyans and some of these, maybe this Yemeni to a lesser extent, are so aware of it. My interpretation is that there's an obscene amount of petrol money sloshing around in these countries, which makes the sort of point that we all know exists so much more obvious than even, say, the Wall Street issues like here in New York. It's sort of the bizarre nature of the sort of construction of rich and poor is blindingly obvious. And so I think among the Egyptian students, some of whom I was sort of paying some attention to, the general idea is they've come to some sort of realization that there is no future. So not that they know exactly what that means, but they know that there's no reason why they need to exist unless there's huge social change into a world which would make them become relevant. And this insight, I think, is something that we all have, but we all repress because it applies, very widely. But there, I think, it sort of people are obliged to have the kind of consciousness that sort of leads it. So I think this is the sort of the dead end kind of thing of neoliberalism. That would be how I would start out. You had a second follow up on this. I'm forgetting now what you exactly said. Oh, on the gender issue. Okay, I think there's a bad habit in Middle East studies academically to lump together something called Islam and women and to kind of regionalize things around culture. This works if you're only going to spend 1 or 2 minutes on the subject, but it really, if you go into it in a more complicated way, I go with the idea of gender plays a role in all the stratification systems in the world, and that it just simply is less prominent in some than in others. In all, it plays this primitive accumulation role that the function of women is to be plundered. In other words, they're the ones whose nature it is to do housework and not get paid for it. So that's the generic cross-cutting function of women in the modern world. The function of gender studies is to deny that. But within different kinds of hegemonies, the position of women is rather different. Now, Libya and Egypt are extremely different. I can talk a little bit about this just in 1 minute, if time permitting.
I strike fear.
In Egypt, if you come from the north of the country, if you're a graduate of a certain set of universities, if you're vaguely middle class and professional, you emerge out of a certain kind of context of limitations, and you can do a great many different kinds of things. On the other hand, if you are a woman coming from, say, the lower middle classes or the working classes of Upper Egypt, and try the same thing, life doesn't offer it to you. So that gender is blurred and blended with other considerations. Now, in Libya, the hegemony really works on what anthropologists call custom. In other words, Gaddafi passed many remarkable laws about women. And so on paper, if you read Libyan laws and what Muammar Gaddafi tried to do in terms of women's unions and direct democracy and so on, it's stunning. On the other hand, if you then study why is it that so few Libyan women are able to sort of benefit and be, in the workforce and earning the kinds of money and salaries and prestige that you would expect? Well, the answer always is custom. And I believe custom is the deep logic. In other words, I think you can, to a certain extent, blame the society for the logic that you've imposed on the society, and that's how this kind of structure works. In other words, the government can look like it's above it all, but in reality, the government is reproducing a certain kind of structure which inhibits people from achieving things, and this is particularly pronounced in the gender issue. And Libya would be an example. So that what Libyan women write and so forth, and probably the political writing would show this, is different from Egyptian. And I think this would go to Iran and yet a third way. That's a really quick.
Sure. Yeah, I would like to just add to what Professor Gran said. It's very interesting empirically that Libya in 1951 had one horrible illiteracy rate, and life expectancy was around 40 years or so. Women, of course, their situation and literacy was even worse. During the monarchy, which was remarkable when it comes to education. And actually, Libyan women, contrary to the impression, were ahead of people, women in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. They have the right to vote since the mid-60s. And education has continued in a quiet way. Probably this is the most remarkable from 1951 under the two regimes until today. Today, life expectancy for women is 77 and for men 74. Of course, this is a very rich country and there's a lot of waste there, but also remarkable things here. We see Libyan women being very prominent. I mean, some university would have 70 or 60% of the higher education ratio are women in Libya. And you have, I'm sorry? Students, some are professors. I don't know about the ratio for the professors, but students are really above 50%, more than males in the universities.
In all fields.
Yes, in all fields. And you have women judges, women doctors, women journalists, women pilots. They really are. They have, in a quiet way, Libyan women have been actually making leaps in their own way, in their own setting. Now, if you're looking for scholars who wrote in this, I can mention to you 3 Libyan female scholars. Professor Amal Labedi, she wrote a book about political culture in Libya, and there is a section on women. Also, Professor Al-Azz al-Farsi, who wrote a very, very important dissertation on participation, and I know that because I wrote the introduction to that book. So that's very important work. And the third one is an earlier work by a very prominent Libyan sociologist who works for the UN, and she has been in the UN's office in Saudi Arabia, Dr. Farid al-Allagi. Now, if you know Arabic, there is also Sharif al-Gayyadi, who wrote about women journalists and writing. And more recently, we have Fatma Ghandour, a Libyan feminist, creative writer and folklorist, who wrote a book about the forgotten women writers. So we have now Libyan women writing their own histories. And they are available in Arabic, some are in English, but we have a whole new generation of Libyan novelists, Libyan poets, Libyan critics, and this is really something I would like to mention, and Khaled knows quite a bit about it, and he translated some of it. Libyan literature, because of all the upheavals that Libyan people went through, is the most outstanding. I think Libyan short stories is, in my opinion, is now among the avant-garde in the whole Arab world. And some prominent names like Hisham Matar, the Libyan novelist who was with us earlier, or the other brilliant and world-class novelist, Ibrahim al-Koni, Ahmad Ibrahim al-Faqih. And these are, for a small country of 6 million, they really are very talented writers, and some of their works, especially al-Koni now, translated in over 40 languages. So I would say, if you're looking for something different from politics and ideological debates, I would advise many of you to read Libyan literature, because the alienation, the critique of the regime, the displacement, the hopes, the preparation for alternative change in Libya, you're going to find that, as in many other societies, in Libyan literature, Libyan poetry, Libyan novels, and Libyan also creative writing.
Yeah, and maybe the example of Iran. When you think of revolutions, whether the Russian or the French or even the Iranian Revolution, they turn to be sort of a conservative. Think of Napoleon wanting to be the king of kings as an outcome of the French Revolution. And before that, Robespierre and the Russian Revolution sort of being capped Stalin and the French Revolution by Khomeini, and the Iranian Revolution by Khomeini. I think, though, that maybe that model of sort of these great revolutions is the classical models where you have a prolonged system of repression. I mean, that worries me, but it seems to me that things are happening at such a scale, and that, again, the idea of suppressing communication. I mean, Ali Saleh in Yemen has not been able to sort of pull the plug on communication on the Yemenis. It's not going to happen in Bahrain. So in a sense, the ability of people to communicate and the limits of the repressive regimes to put people in jail, to suppress these movements, which are largely peaceful. We might be, the technology may be playing a different role into the processes of revolutions of the modern era, in the sense that now the ability to suppress the population is much more difficult. Now, as to if we think of revolutions as processes that have one stage and another, what is the next step in Egypt? You had very, very possible. I mean, when the Shah was about to leave Iran, he put some Bakhtiar as prime minister, and the next step was to bring someone on the other side. So in a sense, in the prime minister's resignation in Egypt today, and you brought somebody closer to the people. It seems like in Tunisia, 2 days before, I mean, Egypt and Tunisia are sort of lock in step as to the same process. Now, where will things go? I think things will go positively, particularly in these two countries. I'm worried about Libya, of course. I think it might go a little longer. I don't know. Tomorrow is going to be decisive, but Tripoli may have to find ways of resisting the regime. But there is nothing for this regime to go on but Tripoli. Now, when will the gender issue play a part? Some of it has to do with the role of religion, but I think it's minor. I think there is a conviction. I'm convinced that people right now are looking at Islam for an inspirational role, not so much a literal role. There is a lot of religious reference in the songs, but the word Sharia has not come up at all in Egypt. It hasn't come up in Libya. It hasn't come up in Tunisia. And these are all, they're different societies. So Sharia is not up for discussion. It may come up, but I feel that there is a real awareness that the issues are not really over whether these societies are Muslim or not, and these are societies that are vastly Muslim. There's a sectarian and Sunni, and so we have a lot of practical issues to deal with. Now, when will the gender issue come up? The law, as my colleague had said, in Libya are all pretty much the laws that Qaddafi had set up. Were maybe progressive, but I think they may be up for discussion. But Libyan women are in this revolution from the beginning. I must note two journalists, and this has never happened in Libya. Two journalists that had been arrested and harassed, and when Qaddafi, again, being the micromanager that he is, wanted to intervene, invited one of them to meet with him, and she publicly refused. She said, "I don't want to meet with you." This has never happened. I mean, you don't say no. And this is by a woman journalist who's become a hero. The first, and a friend of mine, Salim El-Rokli, had said this to me. He said, in Tunisia, they have Abu Azizi In Libya, we have Azizi, which is al-Izz al-Farisi, who was the first person beaten in this revolution when her husband was. Women lawyers are very active. You saw maybe the video of Salwa Boughagis and some Fatma al-Gallal, I think, maybe on Democracy Now, very much in the council. One of them is wearing sort of an Iranian-style hijab, sort of halfway to the head, and another one not. The women not wearing hijab are in the council. These are revolutionary moments, and I'm sure there's lots of sort of tolerance for difference. But I think religion is not playing a role in the jurisdictional sense, but more in the sort of the spiritual element. Whether it will play a greater role, I doubt it, because the main problem is distribution of wealth, employment, and housing for Libya, for the RDC, and work, and the kinds of work that will be provided. And these are, the Sheikh Ghariani of Tripoli had told people to not go to work, to unify with the eastern sector. And this is a sheikh, a Muslim sheikh, who's calling for peaceful protest, not jihad, but peaceful civil disobedience. So already, even the Libyan scholars and ulama are calling for their tone towards how this process of change is different.
I'm going to have to interrupt because I think we're running over, and Yussef wants to make an announcement.
I was hoping to bring tonight really a member of the new youth movement in Libya. He's a young man named Mohammed Nabous. He is from Benghazi. He's an engineer, and he's been responsible for trying to build up Benghazi's communications, and he is one of the lead technicians in building the satellite television station. On the 19th of February, he broadcasted during the attacks in Benghazi on the website Livestream what was going on, and they reached out to the media, and right now he's sent me a message that the internet is off in all of Libya, and there is, I don't want to spread any rumors, so I'll just say that it's unconfirmed that there are bombing runs in different sections of the country, and that, here, I'll read you his message. He said if he's alive, he would like to plan to come online to talk with us, and he suspects, and he's heard, that they are coming to Benghazi to destroy the television station that they're building. So let's hope everything turns out all right. And I'm sorry to depress everyone.
Thank you, Yussef. And thank you all, really. This is a wonderful opportunity for all of us here at Columbia, and we hope for the best for the Libyan people.